today, Venezuelan opposition leader Juan Guaido declared himself the country's interim president amidst
Venezuela and battled President Nicolas Maduro, accusing the U.S. of leading a coup to force him from power.
Una campaña para justificar un golpe de Estado en Venezuela.
Right, so sort of right now, Venezuela almost has sort of two presidents.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the stories that we're covering this week. A coup takes shape in Caracas. Washington is supporting it, and the U.S. news media, who are usually tough on President Trump, make nice for a change. Serbia faces its biggest anti-government demonstrations since the fall of Milosevic, but you wouldn't know it from watching the news there. Fake news and Trump yet again. But this time, it's not the president, it's the First Lady. And in Malaysia, a former prime minister releases a music video just ahead of going on trial in one of the world's biggest cases of corruption.
Inilah hari yang paling sedih dalam hidupku.
When we reported on Venezuela 2 weeks back, we focused on how the domestic media were covering the economic and political crisis there. However, when a relatively obscure opposition figure, Juan Guaido, declared himself interim president, he was quickly backed by the U.S. and many other governments, including right-wing leaders in neighboring Brazil and Colombia, with media outlets there following suit. The U.S. news media covered the push to remove President Nicolas Maduro without saying what that attempt, if successful, would amount to, which is a coup. Instead, the focus has been on the legitimacy of last year's election, which is a relevant point, and it focused on the dire economic situation. But it mostly stayed away from the role that successive American administrations, through economic sanctions, have played in handicapping the Venezuelan economy. As Iraqis, Iranians, Libyans, and others will tell you, this is not the first time that the U.S. has taken a disproportionate interest in the governance of a country loaded with oil. Washington has a playbook for this kind of thing, and so apparently do the U.S. news media. Our starting point this week is Caracas. Two swearing-in ceremonies, 2 weeks apart in Caracas, both of which left much to be desired. January 10th, Nicolas Maduro sworn in for a second term as president after an election last year that the UN, the EU, and the US all said failed to meet accepted standards. January 23rd, Juan Guaido, the head of the National Assembly, swears himself in as president, an office he's never run for, and the US and many other countries quickly announce he's their man.
One hand raised to the heavens. He proclaims himself as president, having no electoral mandate, having no real constitutional legitimacy to do so, before Almighty God and the cameras. That's how you do it nowadays.
80% of Venezuelans have no idea who this man is. But he is very well known in D.C. We know that not only did Mike Pence call Juan Guaido the day before he declared himself president, but in fact the U.S. government has been working with the opposition in Venezuela for decades.
So the situation is dramatic, and I think the simplification of that situation into goodies and baddies, cowboys and Indians is detrimental for our understanding of the situation in that part of the world.
Juan Guaido was partly educated in the U.S. He's a protege of opposition figure Leopoldo Lopez, who the Maduro government has under house arrest. He was first elected to the National Assembly in 2010. However, he only became head of that body early last month. Guaido argues that his claim to the presidency is legally sound, since the Constitution allows for the head of the National Assembly to do that if the Assembly deems the office of the president to be vacant. However, Maduro's supporters argue that Guaido's move and Washington's role in backing it are tantamount to a coup, which is a side of this story that doesn't get much play in the U.S. news media.
It's basically a failed state. So I think at this point they're hoping that they really don't have anything to lose by endorsing Guaido.
This clearly represents a coup, in my opinion. Just recently, John Bolton has been photographed with a document that said 5,000 troops to Colombia. And so therefore, we can see that the American actions are building up a possibly military intervention. And yet, what we see from the media is they refuse to use the word coup, and the reason for this is that the United States media always follows the pronouncements and projections of the US government.
However, coup does also means illegal seizure of power. Now, in Venezuela, what we have is a country and a government where the rule of law no longer applies, where the government itself has violated laws repeatedly, which has lost legitimacy. And when there is no rule of law, then who is to decide what is and is not a lawful removal of a sitting government? What a lot of media have been doing is to only use the term coup by quoting Nicolas Maduro. He sees it as an attempted coup, and it's completely right that it should be reported that that is his view.
To call a spade and an attempted coup is not to defend the Maduro administration. Certainly there is no denying the severity of the problems in Venezuela and the huge responsibility that the Chavez and Maduro administrations have in, for instance, the humanitarian crisis. There is no denying that. There is also no denying that what we are seeing here is a mainly US engineered attempt at a coup.
Selling a humanitarian intervention in Venezuela would be easier for the Trump administration if not for the US's long track record of engineering the overthrow of leftist governments in Latin America. There was 1954 and Guatemala, 1964, Brazil, Chile and Argentina in the 1970s, the list goes on. The New York Times has its own track record of finding reasons to support those coups. It recently published this piece on Venezuela, blaming the state of the economy on the Maduro government's mismanagement and corruption. Other factors, the steep drop in the price of oil, the economic sanctions placed on Caracas by the Obama administration, since widened under President Trump, go completely unmentioned. Although destabilizing economies through sanctions and other means before intervening or invading has been an American tactic from Chile in 1973 right through to the Iraq invasion in 2003.
Sanctions are an act of war, and they hurt the most poor and vulnerable sectors of the population. You can look at Iraq in the late 90s. Sanctions were genocidal. They actually took the lives of 500,000 babies in Iraq.
And that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
The media didn't really report on that. So it's not too surprising that the US media is completely covering up the fact that there are US-led sanctions on Venezuela that just under Trump alone has cost the Venezuelan economy $6 billion.
The sanctions probably aggravated the situation in Venezuela, but it's time that in Latin America we also assume responsibility. Instead of saying some of this stuff is our fault. It's time also to recognize that a huge part of the economy was mismanaged. And the international community have been offering Maduro humanitarian aid, and he repeatedly and systematically has denied that.
There are certain ominous echoes with 2003 in that now we have a very hawkish administration in Washington that is talking of intervening, and we have large sections of the US media in effect acting as cheerleaders.
And it is far more important to shut down the Maduro government than our government. And I think Donald Trump is leading there. That's going to happen. That's going to bring us together.
But it's too easy to think, oh, here we go again. You can only hope that peaceful change comes and some sort of negotiated settlement, which would pave the way to free and fair elections.
Nicolas Maduro is trying to go around the mainstream media, taking his message online, in this case, directly to the American people. However, Maduro's got problems much closer to home. This past week, this headline, "How the U.S. Can Drown Maduro's Economy," appeared in one of Colombia's biggest papers, El Tiempo. The hostility Maduro is now attracting in regional news outlets is a reflection of the rise of the political right in Latin America. It also has to do with self-interest, the millions of migrants Venezuela is now producing, spilling across borders.
The media in South America has shifted decisively against the Venezuelan government. They have seen the the disaster that's unfolding in Venezuela. Wave upon wave of Venezuelan migrants. So the media on these countries are partly reflecting that. In Brazil and other countries where you now have right-wing, in some cases far right-wing governments, that the media also has a vested interest in reflecting the ideological viewpoints of the sitting governments.
None of which reflects well on the news outlets involved or bodes well for Nicolas Maduro. There are shortages of food and medicine, the essential elements of journalism, accuracy, objectivity, context, have also grown scarce. There's a surplus of discontent on the streets, one too many politicians calling himself president, and too much oil under the ground to go unnoticed in Washington. So much at stake. So many political actors with an interest, and so much at issue in the coverage. We're looking at other media stories that are on our radar this week with one of our producers, Flo Phillips. Flo, 2 weeks ago, we looked at a government crackdown on domestic news media in Sudan. One newspaper in particular, Al Jazeera, its offices raided, its journalists harassed. Conditions have since grown worse?
They have. That kind of harassment and censorship is now being felt across the board. The State Intelligence Agency has been busy confiscating copies of Al Watan and Al Tayeh, two of Sudan's leading newspapers. And as of now, 66 journalists have been arrested, and at least 6 correspondents working for foreign media have had their accreditations revoked, including reporters with Al Jazeera and the Turkish news agency Anadolu.
And all of this because President Omar al-Bashir wants to keep a lid on the coverage of demonstrations on the street that have been underway since December.
Right, and he said just that. Speaking at a press conference in neighbouring Egypt, he suggested that the media were overblowing the story. "We do not claim there is no problem," he said, "but it is not at the size that some of the media portray. This is an attempt to copy the Arab Spring." And Bashir is right on one thing. One of the slogans being used by Sudanese protesters, "The people want the fall of the regime," was made famous by uprisings in Tunisia and other Arab states. And given the 8-year anniversary of Egypt's revolution last week, he might be feeling a tad nervous.
On to the UK now, where the Daily Telegraph has paid substantial damages and apologized unreservedly to Melania Trump after the paper got a story on her wrong?
So wrong, it seems. We're not just talking one mistake. The Telegraph is admitting to a whole heap of them. The story, The Mystery of Melania, by American author and journalist Nina Burley, was an excerpt from a book she wrote about the women in President Trump's life. After an unusually swift settlement, the Telegraph took the story off the web and issued a point-by-point correction. This is just part of it. Mrs. Trump was not struggling in her modelling career before she met Mr. Trump, and she did not advance in her career due to the assistance of Mr. Trump. Now, here's the twist. Burley's book was published 4 months ago, and Burley said lawyers had gone through it carefully. So it's been out there. In an interview with the Washington Post, Burley basically accused the Telegraph of caving into the threat of a lawsuit and said that by calling what it published false reporting, the paper had actually defamed her. And all of this was perfect fodder for Trump, who obviously did his bit on Twitter, accusing the Telegraph of fake news.
OK, thanks, Flo. Moving on to Serbia now, and the disconnect between what's happening on the streets and what's going out on the airwaves. Thousands of protesters marched in Belgrade this past weekend, the 9th straight week of the biggest anti-government demonstration since the fall of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000. However, news outlets that either back or fear President Aleksandar Vucic, and that's the majority of the Serbian media, have either ignored the movement or minimized its news value. Vucic came into office in 2012 with the reputation of a former nationalist. He has since resorted to a range of political and financial measures to silence critical media outlets. But he also wants to get Serbia into the European Union, which means counterbalancing some of his autocratic tendencies with a new set of laws supposedly aimed at improving conditions for journalists. Laws that his critics say have more to do with pleasing EU politicians in Brussels than addressing the concerns of citizens and media outlets at home. The Listening Post's Johanna Husnow from Belgrade on the state of the Serbian media.
The demonstrations on the streets of Belgrade are now entering their 3rd month, and the Serbian media are part of the story.
katastrofa što će slobode medija. Nemamo slobodu medija. Po nešto šta imate jedan, eventualno, ali to je malo druga strana koji isto, ali prave slobode nema.
Protesters are calling for an end to what they say are the authoritarian tendencies of President Alexander Vucic and his creeping control of the media. But Vucic made it clear he is standing firm.
Može 5 miliona da vas se skupi nikad.
His comments went viral, and 1 in 5 million has become the slogan of the protests.
Do kritične mase, ali to 10 godina je trebalo kod Miloševića da do toga dođe. Nadam se da ovdje će ipak malo kraće.
Serbian citizens saw that after several years of Alexander Vucic's reign, the story from the 90s, when he served as the Minister of Information under Milosevic, was being repeated. We no longer live in war hysteria now, but Vucic practices the same politics, just with other means and in a more subtle way.
About 90% of the media are under direct control of the government, and these outlets are not really media, but some sort of a propaganda service. For a long time now, almost 7 years, the government has shown that it does whatever it wants, and the situation is not getting better, it's getting worse by the day.
Demonstrators have marched along pretty much the same route, week in, week out, because there's one location in the Serbian capital, one particular address they don't want to miss.
Nearly everyone in Belgrade knows this building. It's the offices of public broadcaster RTS. But since the protests, it's taken on a new notoriety. It's become the symbol of so much that protesters here say is wrong with the Serbian media in the Vucic era.
RTS is a public service paid for by all Serbian citizens, but its news program is completely in the hands of the ruling party. The protests are held right in front of the RTS building, and yet they only get 2 minutes coverage in the 23rd or 25th minute of a half-hour newscast.
Protestne šetnje pod sloganom 1 od 5 miliona održane su u Beogradu I Kragujevcu.
Newspaper Politica, which is also co-owned by the government, reported on the protests on page 5, and despite the protests happening in front of their building, used a photo from Reuters.
The protesters want RTS to stop being state television and take on more of a public service role, where every social group, even if it criticizes the government, can and should have its place. I think Vucic knows very well that the media are a very strong government tool, and I think this is why so much has been done to control the media, why we don't have critical programs, and why most of the mainstream news is undercover propaganda and manipulation.
And it's not just the state outlets. News organizations with close ties to the ruling party also play Vucic's game. In October last year, a magazine called Ilisrovana Politika, which is part state-funded, ran a cover story, a 6-page article, identifying certain independent media outlets and specific reporters as traitors and collaborators of the enemies of Serbia. Journalist unions described the article as a public call to lynch critical reporters, and say such smear campaigns in pro-government media are a common tactic to silence critics. While the government publicly distanced itself from the story, citing the magazine's right to freedom of opinion, journalists working at outlets targeted in the article, like Philip's Farm, say a clear message had been sent.
I felt like I was returning to the last years of Milosevic's regime. I don't know what the intention of the article was, probably to defame some people, to sabotage them, but the fierce dog on the front page, a representation of critical media outlets who aggressively attack the government, has shown the true nature of this regime and how they feel about independent media outlets.
The government has created an environment in which magazines like Ilisrovana Politika feel free to publish something like that. And this wasn't a surprise, because you have similar smear campaigns in tabloids friendly to the regime every day. All of us expect the day when even Politica and TV station RTS will cross that line, publicly targeting opponents of the regime and independent journalists. We're only a step away from it.
Alexander Vucic has been in power since 2012. In addition to smear campaigns, he has been accused of using a host of administrative, political and economic pressures to rein in critical media. I visited the Independent Journalist Association of Serbia, also known as NUNS, which 3 months ago, together with 4 other media associations, composed a letter addressed to the international community on Serbia's deteriorating state of press freedom. The addressee wasn't chosen at random. Serbia formally applied for membership of the European Union in 2009, and for years critics have said Vucic is more concerned with his image in Brussels than in Belgrade. Rather than replying to the media association's concerns, Vucic wrote an extensive op-ed in a European news outlet, the EU Observer, denying accusations that he has monopolized the Serbian media.
We are in this period of Serbian integration into the EU, and we have an obligation to make sure media freedom remains on the agenda during negotiations. Because if you are to believe the government, Serbia is a paradise for journalists. Of course, this is not true, far from it. The journalists here want to do their job freely, but they are exposed to constant threats and cannot work because all opponents of the government are being financially destroyed. The distribution of public funds is murky. Millions of euros are going towards favourable media, but in the last 2 or 3 years, no critical media received any money.
When the budget is deliberately spent on media close to the government, or on outlets whose editorial staff have political or business ties to the government, this becomes a very subtle, yet efficient control mechanism. You either write something in line with the government's agenda, and you get paid for it, or you dare to write something critical, and you don't, which then prevents you from working.
We took these criticisms to the government official in charge of media at Serbia's Ministry of Culture and Information.
I cannot understand, and I am truly surprised that someone who is dissatisfied with the situation in the country, regardless of whether it is the media or something else, goes beyond the borders of Serbia to complain. I really cannot agree with anyone in this country who says that Vucic wants to have absolute control over the media, that he wants an autocratic country in which he will rule as a dictator. Media freedom definitely exists in Serbia. Of course, it can always be improved, but there is space for criticism of the government, and I don't agree with those who say that it is very difficult to report.
The Vucic government says it's drafting new media legislation that will improve conditions for Serbian journalists. But many fear that this new set of laws, called the media strategy, much like the one the authorities adopted in 2011, will be just another list of unfulfilled promises, doing little to satisfy the demands of the protesters who have been marching Belgrade's streets for weeks.
When it comes to the media strategy, I fear that this will be another idealistic wish list, a gesture to the EU. But in practice, little will change, because there are many good laws in Serbia, laws that were copied from other European countries, but they are never actually implemented. Media freedoms are severely threatened, and I think this is the biggest challenge for democracy in Serbia. If this continues, the big question is what Serbia will look like in the coming decades, because without media freedom, almost nothing is possible.
And finally, Malaysia's former Prime Minister Najib Razak is going to court in a corruption trial in a couple of weeks' time over allegations that he pocketed hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money. The 65-year-old Najib is looking at a possible jail term of 200 years. That's 2 centuries. So obviously, he's released a music video in which he, along with a bunch of backup singers, recorded a Malaysian version of a 1970s song made famous by a group called the Manhattans. Najib's contribution is mostly spoken word, not exactly rap, more of a lament, really. He's pleading not guilty and accusing Malaysia's current ruling party, Pakatan Harapan, of slander and revenge. We'll leave you with a couple of verses of that, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.
Inilah hari yang paling sedih dalam hidupku. Setelah tanggal 9 Mei 2018, aku disingkirkan. Selama ini aku berjuang bermati-matian demi rakyat yang amat ku kasih dan sayangi. Tapi apakan daya, aku terinaya dengan mainan Pakatan Harapan yang agenda semata-mata fitnah dan dendam. Apa dayaku ini engkau buat sesuka hati. Tak dapat ku halang kau. Memang kau penista. Memang PH menipu.